Hi everyone, my name is Emily Williams and I'm a graduate student in geography at UCSB. For my submission for the Conference on Building Just Climate Futures Together, I want to talk about the concept of safe climate change. So, safe climate change has been a term that's been thrown around by quite a few people as the threshold or the level of global average temperature rise that we need to stay under as a global community to avoid dangerous impacts. This concept, I believe, is incredibly important as we talk about the kind of world we want to be building in the future and what we see as impacts that are all right to cope with. So, we're at a time right now, especially in the US, but also reaching across Europe and other areas of the world, where seemingly everything is under attack. It's not just about climate change. Healthcare in the United States has been under attack, gender rights, freedom of speech, racial equality, religious freedom, to name a few. So, when we talk about building climate justice futures together, we need to do so starting from the point that all of this stuff is interconnected. And second, we need to do so from an understanding that it's not a far off threat, climate change, but rather understanding that climate impacts are occurring here and now. Climate justice as an organizing principle recognizes the intersection of two very important things: that both people and nature have been exploited for millennia for the accumulation by a select few and the growth of the economy. Climate change is just the most recent example of that accumulation and of that exploitation. So now we have this tricky mix. We need to keep emission levels down. We need to stay below whatever the safe threshold is, but while at the same time tackling the systemic roots of the climate crisis. Carbon fundamentalism is a term that's been thrown around to describe people who are only interested in looking at the emissions. They see climate change as this issue of numbers. It only addresses the first problem. It looks at the issue of climate change and says that we need to propose any solutions that are built on staying within a carbon budget. It's an accounting problem. For instance, California has recently announced that it's going to be signing on to multiple agreements with various provinces, municipalities, and administrative departments in China, trying to make up for the gap that's been left by the United States pulling out of the Paris Agreement. The idea from carbon fundamentalism is if we can make more of these multilateral agreements and just keep under a threshold, then we've won. We've solved the climate crisis. Choosing that threshold then is a game of determining what is safe. What is a safe amount of climate change to undergo? The UNFCCC, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and world governments have originally decided that 2 degrees was a safe limit. That if we warm our planet at a global average temperature rise of 2 degrees Celsius, then we'll avoid some of the worst impacts and we'll be okay. We'll have solved the climate crisis. But the question is, who chose that number? Who gets to make the decision? Only in the Paris Agreement, then in 2015, was it then internationally understood that 2 degrees is still too high for many of the most vulnerable areas in the world, and hence then agreed on 1.5 degrees Celsius. But today, we have already hit 1 degree Celsius of global average temperature rise, and yet we can see climate related impacts around the world already. And yet, because we're still below 1.5 degrees, it has been decided that we are still at a safe level because we haven't yet hit 1.5 or 2. The concept of climate justice pushes back on carbon fundamentalism and highlights that it's not only about the number of carbon dioxide or NOx or methane molecules that are in the atmosphere, but it's about the underlying inequalities that got us into this mess in the first place. And those very same inequalities that are then exacerbated by climate change. The most vulnerable communities to climate impact are not randomly dispersed. It's not where that you're in a bad place at the wrong time, but rather they tend to be communities located in the global south or within the global north. They tend to be communities that are of lower income and communities of color. These people, again, not being randomly dispersed, they have been pushed into environmentally precarious areas due to generations of exploitation. Vulnerability is not simply living next to a coastline. If you have the money and the political means, you can fairly well adapt to rising seas. Vulnerability, rather, is the function of environmental exposure, so being next to an environmentally threatened area, social inequality, and then the structural barriers of a community to adapt. Therefore, the communities that will be the most impacted are those already living on the fringe economically, politically, socially, culturally, and environmentally. Moreover, these communities are already being impacted. Again, this is not just this future far off thing. We can look to, for instance, East Africa with the recent droughts that people have been undergoing, and the farmers there who rely on their crop yields for subsistence, and the crops have been failing due to late rains or rains that just never came. Or we can look at an incredibly salient and yet terrible example of Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, where thousands of people were displaced. A lot of people lost their lives. A lot of infrastructure was damaged, and that typhoon was found to have been exacerbated in intensity by climate change. For these people, safe climate change is already a thing of the past. So what we have is we have two problems right now that we're facing when we're trying to think through how do we move forward and arrive in a future that is built on climate justice. One of the problems is related to this question: is there even such a thing as safe climate change? Or should we rather abandon that idea and instead recognize that any climate change plays a dangerous game with the climate that has supported humans for 200,000 years? And then the second question is, once we've perhaps recognized that there's no such thing as a safe level, but safe for some people, how do we then together build climate justice futures? Safe climate change doesn't exist, just as safe exploitation, safe colonialism, and safe unregulated capitalism are also myths. The ability to decide on a threshold or a certain point that is safe is the very definition of having the privilege of being personally safe beyond that point. However, rallying cries that come out of carbon fundamentalism, the ones that point out that, sure, maybe 2 degrees still has impacts, do point out that 2 degrees is still better than 4 or 5 degrees, or better yet, 1.5 degrees is better than 2. Carbon fundamentalism does play an important role because it does recognize if we can keep emissions down to a certain level, we'll avoid some impacts that would be horrendous, catastrophic, perhaps unimaginable. These aims to keep emissions down are better than nothing, but so long as the solutions proposed to stay below a specific threshold don't make already marginalized communities even more vulnerable than they were before. But we need to be building climate justice futures together, and that means carbon fundamentalists waking up a little bit and starting to think through how to work with the people working on social justice. Now that the US federal government is run by climate deniers, who are also actively attacking marginalized people in a slew of other ways on all fronts, states, cities, and municipalities in our country are taking on leadership roles that tackle climate change and are also actively looking at ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. These local solutions that are rooted in the realities and the needs of local communities, in my opinion, will have more success in truly achieving climate justice than some sort of top-down federal regulation. For not only at the local level do you have the possibility of community-owned energy, so having renewable carbon-free energy at the local level, supporting energy democracy that communities get to have ownership of, but you also have people working on other methods to tackle inequalities. So making sure that communities locally are connected, making them more resilient, and perhaps then more able to deal with the impacts of climate change when they do hit that community. Perhaps at the local level then, we can have an easier time working together because we know each other, rather than fighting over politics and economics and various bills at the federal level, perhaps at the local level, we can see better how these things interconnect and propose solutions that deal with the systemic inequalities that also created climate change in a way that brings the communities together. This can be a place where carbon fundamentalists can coordinate with those fighting for social justice and realize the ways in which their causes and therefore their solutions are interconnected. Long term, these solutions, these local, interconnected, intersecting solutions, are incredibly crucial given that as current greenhouse gas emissions and the ones we know are going to be locked in from just various trajectories forward, we will almost certainly pass 1.5 degrees Celsius, and it's very likely that we'll pass 2 degrees as well. As we then cope with the losses and damages that come out of passing these thresholds, we'll need to think through how to address vulnerability at its root, at the same time as rapidly cutting emissions. Carbon fundamentalists will have their place at this table as they fight to keep greenhouse gases down. But more than anything, this is where we need to be working together, talking across lines, talking across issues, doing the best we can in the causes that we're the best at dealing with, but then also knowing how to work towards solutions that addresses the inequalities at the root of climate change. Perhaps then we'll have a chance.